The big issue is, of course,
where
the case law is still relevant. I think it is. I could see the point. I would say you can make the case, of course, also saying that this is now explicitly written in the directive, so this should be applied when certain requirements are not there in the invoice, but you have other material that is a proof of a certain fact, then this should not stand in the way. I will try to define a model, perhaps a utopian model, as some would describe it. Just give a certain solution that I think makes sense. We have a very broad majority of diligent businesses that really try their best to fulfill the obligations and usually don't have any bad intention when they get something wrong.
Welcome to the VATvocate podcast, where we explore all things value-added tax to give you the insights you need as a VAT professional. Hello everyone, I'm Paweł Mikuła and I'm a partner and founder of Halcyon Tax Customs Legal, and also I am an author here at VATvocate. And before we move on with our new episode and new guest, let me remind you that you should like and subscribe to the channel on YouTube, on Spotify, and don't forget to go to vatvocate.com. There you can subscribe to our newsletter, and if you are subscribed, you have access to database of case law on the VAT of Court of Justice of the European Union. You have also summaries of a couple of dozens of cases, and also you can get the weekly update on what's going on in the court. And now I would like to welcome our new guest, Stefanie Geringer. Hi, Stefanie.
It's nice to be here.
Thank you for accepting this invitation. Stefanie is a fabulous VAT lawyer and expert whom I follow for some time now, and it's good that we can speak. So once more, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for inviting me, and also thank you very much for your kind words. It is much appreciated.
Great, thank you. So Stefanie is a post-doctoral researcher at Vienna University. She also is a post-doctoral researcher at the university, Masaryk University in Brno. Currently, you are dealing with the interplay between the procedural VAT law at the level of the member states and at the level of the European Union. Is that right?
That's
generally?
Correct. Yes. So I have a comprehensive postdoctoral research project. Those in the German-speaking countries and also in the Czech Republic and Poland will know what it is, the habilitation, what we refer to as the second book internationally, just to make it easier for others to understand what we are doing. And this book is concerned with defining an appropriate allocation of the procedural competences in VAT law between the EU and the member states. This was essentially designed to, I would say, define a theoretical framework based on the competence principles in the EU treaties, while I can see the project moving forward in the sense that I will try to define a model, perhaps a utopian model, as some would describe it. Just give a certain solution that I think makes sense, and then others can discuss it. They can accept it, reject it, but at least there's something that we can work with.
As usually in academic world and research, that's the point of the research, to give a new thesis, to test new hypotheses and so on, to share a spotlight on new fields that can be brought to discussion. So you also made a BA in Slavonic Studies, is that right? With specialty in Czech language?
I'm almost done. Unfortunately, I still have to take 3 exams, but I'm close to obtaining my bachelor's degree in Slavonic Studies. That's right. And my main language is Czech.
Your main language within those studies, or your main language as a native, originally? No.
Quite interesting, because when people hear me speak Czech and they see that I'm somewhat fluent, they ask me whether I have Czech parents, relatives. So I have distant relatives in the Czech Republic, which was the original motivation for me to learn Czech. But indeed, it is not my first language, so it is just another foreign language that I have acquired over the years.
Okay, that's very interesting because Czech, Slavic languages, to say the least, Czech language, I guess it's not a first language to choose to learn. So that's very interesting, and congratulate on that. So I believe you understand a little bit of Polish.
Perhaps, if you do not speak too fast, I would say that I have a certain sense of. Usually, I would say at least I get the bottom line of what you're saying.
Okay, yeah, that's what we understand when we hear Czech and vice versa. So most probably because of the analogy, let's say. The reason for today's discussion is, of course, your research on the procedural law and so on, and the main trigger was your article "United in Diversity: Historical Explanations for the Limited Harmonization of VAT Procedural Law in the EU." So this is the article that was recently published by you, and we will, if it's possible, we will of course put the link in the comments so that everyone or the description of the podcast of the episode wherever it will be published. So I hope that's possible. If possible, we will do that. And so in your article, you describe, let's say, the evolution of the VAT procedural law or procedural autonomy of the member states in the context of VAT law. So obviously we will move into that, but at the outset I wanted to ask you, do you have any definition of or delimitation or the line that draws a distinction between the substantial law and procedural law, because obviously this is a even problem discussed at the theory of law level and so on. I believe I saw even books that had 300 pages about this problem. So do you see any of such a line of division, or you just you have some kind of assumption before going to the further research on that? Do you distinguish those two bodies of law, or it's not useful for you because you concentrate on something else?
Thank you for this question, and indeed is this, I would say, an excellent question to kick off the conversation. And it's, I have to say, a question that I get very often when I present on my research in this area, which is not too surprising because it's a very fair question indeed. And I agree with you that it's very difficult to draw a line usually. In particular, in VAT, I would say there is a very close interaction between the substantive law and the procedural law. What sometimes further blurs the line, I would say, is if we have a look at the case law by the European Court of Justice on what they refer to as procedural autonomy of the member states, you can see that there's also this kind of mix-up between what I refer to as substantive and procedural aspects. So you might have case law on deadlines, on registration requirements, then somehow coupled with sanctions, with questions about VAT fraud, abuse of law. So everything somehow put together, what we would perhaps rather not see entirely as procedural law under our national understanding. But of course, it very much depends on how you define it. So this is, of course, a core aspect of my broader research for the monograph that I work on, where I will explain in more detail what I consider to be procedural law in the context of VAT. I could only include a footnote in this particular article due to the limitations in scope. But essentially, I'd say I make a perhaps traditional or usual distinction, rather referring to substantive law as the what and procedural law as the how. So very much thinking about how the law is enforced, how it is applied, while I both consider the provisions on the procedure itself for example, registration requirements. On the other hand, I also want to concern myself with institutional requirements, although this was not part of the current article, but something that I am now working on in more depth is also the authorities that essentially apply and enforce the law, which I also consider to be a very important aspect of VAT procedural law, particularly because there's currently a discussion going on at the EU level, perhaps also somewhat initiated by the VAT expert group and the paper that they published, where they gave a certain idea of what an EU VAT authority or agency could look like. So this is something that I would also include.
Yeah. So it's very interesting because in Poland there was this debate for some time, and there were actually surprisingly many publications on this, whether those formal obligations like registration, like submitting information, providing documents proving, 0% VAT rate on our intra-community supply of goods, or submitting VAT return, all those obligations. There was, academic actually discussion, but there was significant discussion whether these are procedural obligations or substantial obligations. I think that the thesis that prevailed is that they are more substantial, because if you fulfill this obligation, you have this and this result in an amount of the tax to be paid. If you don't fulfill, you don't have your level of tax is lower, and so on. But is it something you think? Is it this discussion, this question is a more general or only Polish specificity, or this is more general, or maybe do you see this question as an important one, or maybe it's something that it's obvious for you that these are procedural obligations, or how do you look at it?
I'd say it's not necessarily only a question that's relevant in the Polish context. It's not only a question that is relevant to VAT law, actually, because we can see in other fields as well that there's the discussion what is substantive law, what is procedural law, and it might be very difficult to draw the line there, in particular because these areas interact. And to a certain extent, I would say that the question is not too important, due to the fact that essentially, when we talk about the allocation of competence between the EU and the member states, we will have to have a look at what is the EU able to do under the principle of conferral of powers, and also under the shared competences. Where does the EU has the EU competence, and to what extent does the EU make use of this competence? And if it does not, then it's upon the member states to define the law, or when the EU is not allowed, or I would say it would not be legitimate for the EU to make use of certain competences. It is upon the member states, and this is a truism, I would say, of EU law that applies equally to substantive law and procedural law. So to a certain extent, the relevance is perhaps diminished. I make this delimitation, of course, in the book, because I have to say what is more or less within the scope of my research. I could see why there is an argument about this in VAT law, when people also think about the fact, if I fulfill a certain criterion, do I have a right, or is a certain right taken from me? So something that we've also seen in the context of the quick fixes, when there were certain requirements put in place, and now we have discussion, if we do not make the recapitulative statement in time in the context of the intercommunity supplies of goods, does this have an effect on me applying the exemption or not?
Yeah, this was actually because I also in my book within PhD, I also touched upon, I guess, this question, this problem, and I always thought about this, that this question is very academic and theoretical, and you always have to think about what are the consequences of this position or of this position. Whether the most important question is whether you have right to exemption when you have the document and when you don't, and it's not that important to make up your mind whether it's procedural or substantial. You just need to, of course, if you're writing a book or doing the research, you have to, as you mentioned, describe the scope of your research field and so on, and questions and so on. But from the very practical perspective, it's not that important. The results are most important, obviously. Okay, so in your article, you're kind of describing this was very surprising and eye-opening for me. You describe the let's say historical evolution of this procedural autonomy of the EU VAT law, let's say, or procedural autonomy of the member states concerning the EU VAT law. And you drawing and describing the historical evolution, but generally evolution in time of this procedural autonomy. Can you briefly describe to us the evolution?
And I have to say, it was very eye-opening for me, this kind of research. It was rather, my motivation was to actually, I would say, build a foundation for my research on the allocation of competences by having a look at what has happened so far and then work with the status quo. And it was very interesting for me as well, actually, to actually see what was going on, knowing, of course, what is the status quo now. So indeed, we could already see the first approximation measures in what I refer to as VAT procedural law in the second directive of 1967. So really the first measures that were taken at what is now the EU level. They concerned mainly 4 obligations, including bookkeeping, invoicing, filing of tax returns, and payment of the VAT due. While essentially, they only introduced this obligation, but they left lots of discretion to the member states to adapt the relevant requirements.
Sorry for interrupting. So at the first stage, we have second directive. We have very basic, fundamental, obviously substantial law on VAT. The first norms concerning the European VAT, and generally, as I understand, please correct me if I'm wrong, generally it's a substantial law, but there are first very, very limited mentions about, in the limited scope, very limited mentions about kind of first formal obligations, procedural obligations. Is it a good way to put it?
Yes, I would agree with this. And what's particularly interesting, the second directive, is that you had one article on this, Article 12, where you had the obligations included. The language was already very flexible in this article, but then you still had an annex to the directive where actually this was further opened up to the member states. And it was mentioned in the preamble that the annex is also part of the directive. So you had this kind of a bit of a weird relationship because apparently it was not important enough to put it in the article. Still, there was the annex, which should similarly be of relevance. So an interesting way of legislative design, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have the second directive. We have first mentions about. So generally, the system is aimed at obviously stipulating the very fundamental, substantial obligations or substantial law on VAT. But we have first mentions about some kind of procedural aspects, formal obligations, stuff like this, and then we are going further.
Yes. Then with the sixth directive, we had certain clarifications. Well, I would particularly highlight what was added to what we already had. So interestingly enough, registration requirements were only introduced in the sixth directive to more or less confirm existing practices in the member states. We could also find initial measures on simplification, particularly for smaller businesses, to relieve certain burdens. And then there's also what we now know as Article 273 of the directive, where member states were allowed to introduce additional obligations to ensure the correct collection of VAT and perhaps also counter any undesirable practices, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
From there, the next step I would say was particularly I would particularly refer to the 8th and the 13th directive, a very specific field of harmonization concerning the procedures for the refund of input VAT to businesses established abroad. The 13th directive is still relevant to third country businesses. There is not too much of a harmonization. Actually, in this area, it's essentially member states should refund the input VAT based on certain criteria, essentially also requiring proof that somebody has indeed no output supply, so they are eligible for the refund. And they should not discriminate against EU-based businesses when applying certain rules to third country business, so they cannot be more favorable. But otherwise, much is left to the member states, and I think we can also see very divergent practices in this area. The 8th directive has meanwhile been amended, so there is a new regime in place that replaced this paper-based system that was introduced by the 8th directive.
So in other words, we are at the level of the 6th directive, then we have 13th directive and 8th directive. So those directives that allows me to reclaim or refund European VAT when within the European Union, when I'm established within the European Union, 8th directive, and when I'm established outside the European Union, 13th directive, I am able to refund this VAT charged on invoices that I receive in different member states. And because of this mechanism, because the substantial mechanism of refunding was introduced, it was pretty much natural to add some formal obligations, substantial law around that, right? So this was the reason. Do I understand correctly that you see it as the reason for stipulating those new procedural obligation? Because obviously, I understand that if you introduce provisions like this, if you allow businesses from outside your member state or from outside the European Union to refund the VAT, it's natural to have procedural law around that regulates this procedure of refunding. Would that be the reason of the phenomenon of growing of numbers of those obligations here?
It's indeed quite interesting. So apparently the member states already had certain procedures in place. Well, I can imagine that might have also been a certain source of legal uncertainty, simply thinking about the fact how this perhaps interacts with what is already there at EU law. So I could see a case for perhaps just making sure that existing practices are also legitimate, that they are, I would say, interacting nicely also with the common legal framework. But it was very revealing to have a look at the preparatory materials describing that there were divergent practices among the member states, and apparently a certain need was felt to at least create a certain common system. There was still a certain room for maneuver by the member states, but at least ensure that there is a certain bottom line, that businesses would not be hindered in providing their goods and services across border. So it was apparently perceived as a hindrance to establishing the common market. And interestingly enough, it was also pointed out on some occasions that there was also a fear that this would be a source of unwanted competition between the member states. So if some had very favorable provisions in place, that this might create a certain incentive to acquire supplies from certain member states, perhaps also in relation to third countries. And so this was apparently another driver for this.
Okay, so I paint the picture in my mind that at the very outset, as you mentioned at the very beginning, the main focus was again at the level of the second directive and so on. The approach was to stipulate the substantial law, but then there was an evolution in growing number of those procedural obligations, procedural law, and the reasons for that was that there was a fear that member states may compete with each other in this area. So, for example, Poland stipulates less formal obligations, more favorable procedural law than France, for example. It's hard to imagine that it's that way, but let's assume. And this way, the member states will compete, right? So this is the one of the reason of the drive to harmonize those procedural law at the European Union level. Okay, so we have stopped at the level of the sixth directive. So let's come back to the evolution in time of those procedural obligations and procedural law. So we have finished at sixth directive, 8th directive, and 13th directive. Do you have any further stages of this story?
Indeed. So what I then saw as another relevant factor, in particular, because this more or less was, I would say, the endpoint of the introduction of the substantive system that we have now at the EU level, which is a transitional system, which brought about the last taxable transaction or taxable supply as we know it in Article 2 of the VAT directive now, including the intercommunity acquisition of goods. And it's also very relevant, I would say, because the first cross-border procedure was introduced. So what I mean by that, or how I define it in my work, are the procedures where two of the member states' tax authorities, or at least two tax authorities, have to work together. In this sense, because you have the recapitulative statement going from one member state to the other, which is still in place, of course, and we know that it will soon be replaced by the digital reporting requirement, or at least soon enough in a few years. And at this time, the obligation of also having identification numbers for the business was also introduced, simply to make the common reporting system work. And since this time, so this was 1993 when this directive took effect, we mainly saw refinements in the law. In particular, if you followed the discussion, I think it's not so surprising to anybody that invoicing rules were very prominent, or they featured very prominently, usually in reform proposals. Also very recently, of course, due to VIDA, now with the e-invoicing obligations cross-border. And what we could also see is a certain proliferation of cross-border procedures, in particular, all kinds of procedures based on the one-stop shop concept. Of course, we have the free OS schemes now, but also the current refund procedure could be described as a procedure based on the one-stop shop concept, the idea that the tax authorities of the member states in which I'm established function as a single point of contact. We now have a similar concept also in place for the cross-border SME procedure. So I would say that this is the biggest innovation of the last couple of years.
Okay, so we see that another state that you are mentioning is the transitional system of intra-community supply of goods, intra-community acquisition of goods. And because the European Union legislator introduced this transitional mechanism, this mechanism of the trade of goods between the European Union member states, in essence, it is a substantial law, this mechanism. But due to the fact that they introduced this, they also needed to build up on this other different procedural law, procedural obligation concerning the registration for I understand, for VAT purposes in the European Union, so the European VAT ID and EC sales list and so on. So this was the trigger, and then we are moving to VIDA. Future of VAT, where it will be the case that you will need to issue an electronic invoice within the European standard to document this through this invoice, to document such intra-community supplies, acquisition, and different other EU transactions. And also we have one-stop shop, and also we have this new scheme for SMEs. So I really see, and it was eye-opening when I read your article that indeed the new initiatives and new inventions in the substantial law triggered those growing number of procedural obligations and so on. So this evolution is very clear here.
No, certainly. It was very interesting for me just to see how often changes to the substantive law actually acted as a catalyst, I would say, for introducing new schemes, in particular, also highlighting the fact, perhaps, as we all know, that originally there was the idea to have an origin-based VAT system in the EU, which has been abandoned a few years ago, or I would say also abandoned by the European Commission. I'm not so sure whether the member states were always convinced of this idea, but generally we have now the movement towards a destination-based system, which is beneficial for various purposes. But of course, it means if we have a destination-based system, it will essentially also trigger all kinds of compliance requirements for businesses in the various destination countries, depending on where you operate your business or where you also offer your supplies. And in the current environment, when we have, of course, a free movement of services, of goods within the European Union, but it's also, of course, a lot easier now due to digitalization to offer your services across borders. And so I would say the procedural issues have become a lot more relevant over the last couple of years, in particular because of this movement towards destination-based system.
And can you, if we are touching on this topic, can you say a few words additionally about the destination based system and exemplary, I don't know, formal obligations around us? I don't know if it's too early to talk about this, but can you add a little bit more for our very busy listeners how this destination, in very broad terms, according to the general principles, how would that destination-based system would work? I think it's a good opportunity to clarify for everyone.
No, of course. So this, of course, already many years ago. So I already grew up. So when I studied law, this was already the norm. But previously, it was not the norm for B2B supply of services. Just to use, I would say, the most important example for B2B supplies, it was not the norm that, as a general rule, the place of supply would be where the customer is located, which has been introduced through a directive now almost 20 years ago, actually. So the general rule for B2B supplies, Article 44 of the VAT directive, that the supply of services has its place of supply where the customer is located, so usually where the business is established, or depending on the circumstances, where they have the fixed establishment. In a general sense, and also more broadly, when we have a look at the B2C supplies of goods and services, we can see a certain movement towards the destination place, so meaning where the customer would usually live, or at least where it is, because it is assumed that they would consume the goods or the services where they are established. So, of course, it will be very hard, depending on the situation at hand, to really locate more or less where is the destination. So it would usually be the address or many places where they actually acquire the goods, if it is a face-to-face transaction.
And now a short break and a quick tip, because we have prepared something special for you. It's a Court of Justice VAT rulings database. It contains all VAT judgments and orders issued since the 70s, with search, keywords and links. And not just that, the best thing is that the database will be updated periodically. And how to get it? By subscribing to our free VAT newsletter. Link in the description. And don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast for more VAT discussions like this one. Coming back to the procedural autonomy, so you described those procedural obligations and procedural evolution of this procedural law at the EU level. So we have a picture where generally, as a rule, European Union stipulates the provision for harmonizing through the substantial law of the EU VAT system. And of course, there are different formal and procedural obligations that pop up during this process. And there is this notion of procedural autonomy of the member states. So this is the question that bothers me a lot, whether when we are talking about procedural autonomy of the member states, it means that, okay, it is as it is, in a sense that, as a rule, European Union legislator only stipulates the substantial law, but the formal obligation, the procedural obligations, is something secondary, something ancillary. So from this historical evolution, we see that it is a kind of norm, kind of principle, that usually the substantial law is the principle. Usually the substantial law is stipulated by the European Union, and formal law or procedural law is not stipulated by the European Union. So this is kind of norm that stems from this historical evolution, or there are any other sources of this principle, if you know what I mean? Is there some kind of normative principle or a norm that indicates that, as a rule, in principle, member states should regulate the procedure and European Union should regulate the substance, or it is not that way? So maybe I will rephrase it so everybody understands whether there is a principle or norm or indication that European Union should not stipulate procedural law, or how does that work? Are there any other sources of such a principle? Does such a principle actually exist, or it's just a fact from this historical evolution?
I'm really great that we're going to talk about this as well, because I'm happy to confirm this has bothered me a lot, actually, also in my research, because you come upon this term, principle of the procedural autonomy of the member states, so often, in particular in the case law, but also in the literature.
Exactly. Sorry for interrupting. That's why that's why I'm asking for. I'm interrupting so to explain to our listeners. So, actually, in the Court of Justice of the European Union case law concerning VAT, many times courts invokes this principle of the procedural autonomy of the member state, meaning that the member state as a rule should regulate their procedures. But the question is, where did it come from, right?
No, indeed, if you more or less try to trace this notion and when it came up. So from the case law, it is not only used in VAT law, perhaps also relevant for the reasons to point this out, that this is something that comes up in all areas of EU law, I would say, at least the harmonized areas. And it was originally, I would say, a child of the literature, actually. Somebody framed this notion of procedural autonomy, and then it just was also applied, or I would say it was just taken from the literature by the Court of Justice, and they use it as well. So I remember from the VAT law cases, in particular Remtsma, where they mentioned it, and this was perhaps the first one where I would really say that they used the term as such, principle of the procedure of the member states, but please do not make me guarantee it. This was really the first one, but this was the first one where I noticed it. And it's quite interesting, because I think this kind of framing, principle of the procedural autonomy of the member states, is misleading, indeed, as you already mentioned, and a few people have been very critical of it. In the literature, I would say the most vocal critique of the court's framing is Michael Bobek, the former Advocate General, saying that this is very misleading, because, as I understand it, I would not consider this principle to be something comparable to a general principle of EU law or a similar standard. What if you have a look at the case law, or what the court describes in the context of the principle of procedural autonomy of the member states, as they call it, is essentially the fact that I described at the beginning, that VAT and most of other areas of EU law are areas of shared competence, meaning that both the EU and the member states have the competence. To a certain extent, we have competence bases, in particular Article 113 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, telling us where the EU legislature can set legislative standards for VAT law, among other indirect taxes. And as far as the European legislature has not yet made use of these powers, then it's still upon the member states. And as far as the powers have not been conferred to the European Union, it is also for the member states to define the relevant law, to define the institutions that apply and enforce the law. So essentially, this notion should encapsulate a phenomenon that we know more generally from EU law is not only relevant to procedural matters, but it also applies similarly to substantive law, where we still have a certain discretion under VAT directive, which we do have in some areas. A good example is VAT grouping, I would say. Then it's upon the member states.
So in other words, we have at the EU level, we have treaties and the primary law and everything. It indicates the division of competence between the member states and the European Union. But among those divisions, there is no such a division for the procedural law and the substantial law. There is for example, in terms of VAT, in terms of other branches of law, but there is no such a division. So in other words, it is very hard, if I understand correctly, please correct me if I'm wrong, there is no such a very clear source of this principle. As you said, it is not a principle as we are used to call other principles, fundamental principles for the whole EU law or VAT law in particular. Is that a good way to put it?
Indeed, I agree. So I would not see it as a principle, simply describing the realities of an area of shared competence as we have it in VAT law. And perhaps also interesting for many of our listeners, just to stress the fact that it doesn't necessarily have to be the way that we are, the way that we have it now in VAT law, that we have a decentralized enforcement of EU law. In VAT, we have actually all kinds of variations depending on the area of EU law. Very famously, previously, competition matters were essentially enforced by EU authorities. Of course, this is a core area of the internal market, so I can see why they also had a centralized administration of the law. We still have EU agencies in many areas of law, all operating on, I would say, within different scopes depending on what the law allows. So essentially, depending on what we have in the law, it would not actually be necessary to have so much of a procedural autonomy, of course, depending on how you see the competences being allocated between the EU and the member states.
Is there such a thing as a procedural autonomy or not? How do you see it?
I would necessarily describe it as autonomy. This is another matter that has been discussed quite intensely in the literature. So a rather linguistic question that very well speaks to me as somebody obtaining a degree in humanities and with particular passion for linguistics. So what I would rather describe it as a competence, because this is what it actually is. I think autonomy is the wrong word, because it's also implying that where member states can set certain procedural standards, then they would actually be free, more or less, to do what they want, which is also not the case, because they still have to consider the requirements of primary law. In particular now also the fundamental rights under the Charter, which is now more and more the subject of the case law. And also to a certain extent, of course, general principles of EU law.
So of course there is such a phenomenon of competency or autonomy. You're against this expression, but the phenomenon exists to be researched, but it's not such a principle as other principles as we described. Okay, so because obviously in VAT law, in the Court of Justice case law, I see that in some judgments, in some resolutions, the court says that there is this autonomy, there is this procedural autonomy of the member states. So we are leaving for the member states to decide on certain different matters, but in some other judgments, in some other case law, the court takes very hard stance, I would say, very hard, strict position on very particular, very specific and very detailed procedural indications for the member state, as for example, that the person has to prove the condition for the exemption of 0% VAT rate on intra-community supply of goods, or the court ruled that the taxable person has to prove the conditions for deducting input VAT, or that the tax authorities must prove conditions for VAT fraud or VAT abuse. Or, for example, I have noted down a couple of those, or the requirements with the burden of proof cannot be improportionate. It cannot be too heavy for the taxpayer, or irrefutable presumption are not allowed, or when tax authorities apply inductive estimation of VAT or of different amounts concerning VAT, the taxpayer should have all the instruments to rebut the estimation, to rebut any presumptions, and so on, so on. So for me, clearly from the case law of the Court of Justice, it stems very clearly that the court derives from the VAT law, from the European Union VAT law, very concrete and very specific, detailed indications about the procedure, how the tax authority should approach or should not. The burden of proof is something very procedural in my understanding. So there is a certain, I would say, body of law stemming from the case law concerning the European standards as to the procedure. And again, the Court of Justice said in other judgments, as I said, about the procedural autonomy. So there is a kind of conflict I see between those two phenomenons. What do you think about that? Do you have any comments on this observation?
That is indeed a very interesting field, and I would say a very controversial field, also more generally among the EU lawyers, what is often referred to as the creeping competence of EU law, somehow initiated by the case law. Because we can see, as you already pointed out, that the court has very different approaches to, I would say, in a certain sense, intervening with national law. It's also quite interesting to see, although this is something that I'm still trying to getting my head around, actually, that it also seems to depend on who is actually deciding on a certain matter. So which chamber is deciding, and when you know to some extent what certain judges are more in favor for or less, you could see that they are more or less intrusive in a certain sense with the decisions. And it's also a very good question.
You mean you see the difference in this intrusivity, if there is such a word, I don't know, the difference between judges or the chambers, or?
I would say so in a certain sense, although perhaps it's also because I know the academic work, or more generally publications or statements from certain judges, where I know that how they perceive the relationship between the national judges and the EU judges, and where some would, I would say, understand Article 267, so the main provision on preliminary requests, rather restrictively, that they would say it is really about interpreting the EU law. So we might give a certain framework, how we understand, for example, the principle of proportionality or the principle of protection of legitimate expectations, but we really don't make any further statement on how this applies to the case at hand. As it should be if you read Article 267 very strictly. But of course, we also know that there is certain case law where the court, I would say, at least implies more or less directly what they would actually like to see as an end result at the national level. And in some decisions, the court is very, very blunt in a certain sense, meaning that we have decisions where the court said that a time limit of 3 years is acceptable, where I would actually see a problem, to be honest, not because I can see the point for the businesses. Of course, as well as a tax practitioner, I have to deal with clients, and they are happy if they know that there is a certain EU standard. Whether or not this is actually enforced and lived as such in the member states is a matter on its own right, of course. But more generally, I can see why some would actually like to have this kind of legal certainty, where the court really says, based on the principles, this time limit is okay, this one is not. But I see a big problem under the rule of law as a lawyer, that there is still the question of legality or perhaps legitimacy. If you think about the fact that the court should interpret the law, but they should not decide on a certain case. And in particular, we have this very sensitive times, politically sensitive times, where we can see certain movements or a certain dissatisfaction, whether it's legitimate or I would say justified or not, in some member states where people are dissatisfied with what the EU is actually doing and how much they influence what is going on the national level. And if we have the court setting standards because the EU legislator is currently not legislating in a certain area, I could see why many people would have a problem with that, even though I would also wish for the businesses that they would have a certain framework. But it's still, I would say, in a certain sense, when we talk about what is actually the content of a hard law provision, usually, that this is still very much something that the EU legislator should do. And we should also think about the fact that there's also a horizontal allocation of powers between the EU institutions, so they should respect their various competences. And in some way...
So you're saying that court goes too far sometimes?
Yes.
Okay, very concrete, short answer. Yeah,
I'm happy to decide on this one. People who know me, I would not necessarily... I would say that I have a differentiated approach to the case law more generally. I am critical of certain aspects because I also want to think about the mid and long-term implications to some extent, because the question, of course, it is... in some cases, we might say that this is very beneficial what the court is doing. If the court says that a certain time limit it's disproportionate, that the burden of proof rules are just too extreme, that the burden is too heavy on the taxpayers, of course, the clients will be happy to hear something like that. But we also have to think about the fact that it could also go the other way around. And this is something that we would also have to think about. And I think a good example, also from a business perspective, is the case law on VAT fraud and abuse of law, to some extent, where we all know that based on the case law, we could actually have accumulation of sanctions along the whole entrepreneurial chain, which I'm very critical of. So we should be very careful what we wish for when we want the court to be more active, because the EU legislator is not.
Yeah, of course. I totally agree in a sense that as I expressed my opinion on different forums and in different writings, I'm also critical to couple of areas that the Court of Justice take its position on. Of course, we are all aware of that the court did a great job for the last couple of dozens of years within the EU VAT system. It did a good job in many aspects, but there are also aspects that are that we could be more critical towards. Okay, so this is great. So generally, you would not only speaking about the court, but generally you would be an advocate for a stronger harmonization of the procedural law, or you would like to leave it to the member states?
As a lawyer, I would say it depends. No, but just the classic answer, of course. I would say perhaps I would say an interim position. So in the sense, because I approach the topic differently in some respects, what we often find in the literature is a certain proposal for a certain measure, or they focus on a particular problem or something that I also perceive in practice what might go wrong. And there's a certain solution immediately presented, or certain, I would say, different solutions that are thinkable, which is also very important, of course, to think about the solutions. But in the first step, I would also think about what we can do at the EU level, and then think about the solutions that are available. Also, as I already mentioned, as a matter of legitimacy, that I would start at the point what is actually allowed. And then not only think about the procedure as such and the particular requirements such as registration or bookkeeping, but also think about the institutional question and how this interacts. This is something that is still very much work in progress. So I don't want to I don't want to say that this is my definitive answer, but just something to give you a sense of what I'm thinking about in this context. I have a paper currently that is being published, hopefully soon enough, where I more generally think about what are the issues currently. It boils down essentially to two factors that I would say that they are very often mentioned. The one is the requirement for multiple registrations. So what we currently see in the discussion for a single VAT registration in the EU. So the necessity that I have to deal with different member state authorities in different countries. And the second problem is then as well, when we have the cross-border elements, how do we arrive at a common solution so there is no double taxation or perhaps also no double non-taxation? And what could also be thought about further, this is also not something that I would now make up, but I would say this is discussed to some extent. It has been discussed actually for several decades, although there were different terms for this. But if you think of expanding the scope of the one-stop shop idea, for example, and the more you focus on having one tax authority being the single point of contact for a taxpayer, then I would say that you could already actually get rid of many problems. And then also perhaps think of mechanisms to prevent and resolve disputes. Of course, it would also be necessary to make further refinements, but this is just one idea, just to show that there are certain issues that we perceive in practice. And there is not necessarily, it's not necessary in all cases to think about centralization. It would not necessarily be the solution or the only solution to think about harmonization and centralization, but also think about how can we make life easier for businesses while still trying to preserve a certain discretion for the member states, which might be sensible in certain areas for certain reasons.
So you're talking right now about the general, let's say, about the future, about what can be figured out and what can be stipulated in the EU law. So you're talking about new mechanisms that can be introduced in the EU law. For example, I don't know, one tax authority, one registration for all the matters, one authority towards which I'm contacting and submitting everything to one authority. So these are the ideas to be stipulated in the secondary EU law, so to speak. But again, coming back to as the things are right now, you have already to some extent answered this question, but I understand your position that you think that as the things are right now, the member states right now have pretty broad competence, pretty broad autonomy, let's say, in terms of procedural matters, or they are limited with something?
I would say that essentially, of course, it depends on what you define as broad or less broad, but I would say that they have a certain discretion. It's not that they are now essentially, I would say, bound in a certain sense to apply certain time limits or apply a certain interest, for example, apply a certain rule of evidence rules. We might have the discussion about who has to prove what, where I see the court, at least from an Austrian perspective, nothing that I would not know from the national law, and at least the national laws that I am familiar with apply a similar idea, what I call the sphere theory, or how it is called in the German literature, meaning that every party has to prove what is more or less favorable to them, just to put it very simply. So essentially the authorities have to prove that I have done something wrong or the criteria are not fulfilled, where I have to prove that I have a certain right. But more or less coming back to this, I would say indeed that the member states still can define in a certain way how the law should be applied, how it should be enforced, so how the procedures should be designed. They also decide which institutions essentially apply and enforce the law. So whether they want to have one-tier tax authority, two-tier tax authority, whether there are differences in the geographical scope and similar things. So essentially, I would still say they have a very broad discretion overall. But of course, we have the law, and then we also have to think about the practice, so how the law is enforced. And then we also have, of course, a certain discretion, just thinking about the fact that somebody has, when you think about whether somebody has reasonably done everything, more or less, to make sure that they were not part of a fraudulent scheme. Of course, there's still the question if there's a certain tax official and they get the facts at hand to assess, they might arrive at different conclusions. So we also have to think about I would say, the human factor, or at least when it comes to assessment of the facts, there will always be a certain discretion, because you cannot say for each case that this is 100% the same facts as in this case law.
Another question connected with all what you're saying about, so you're also a VAT lawyer, and you write, for example, the compliant to the court or any other, instrument to the court. Would you invoke the principle of procedural or of autonomy of the member states if it were favorable for your client, for example? Would you invoke such a principle?
I would use a different language.
Okay. That's the answer.
Or as I would do it, like I did it before, I would perhaps say the court refers to it as the principle, but I would not describe it as such that I call it the principle of the procedural autonomy.
Okay. Very, very, very specific, concrete answer. Okay, so I have very last question to you that you have touched upon already, but it concerns those formal obligations. So, to some stage of the case law of the Court of Justice, to some point in time, it was pretty much obvious that if you fulfill the formal conditions for example, exemption or on intra-community supply of goods, if you fulfilled the substantial condition of exemption, you have the right to exemption, even though you have not fulfilled the formal obligation, meaning, for example, presenting the proof that the goods left the country, for example. The same we had with right to deduct on reverse charged acquisitions. The same we have in many different fields of different questions and issues concerning VAT. So if you fulfill the substantial conditions, you have the right to the more favorable treatment if you even though you did not fulfill the formal conditions. But as you know, and you know what I'm aiming at, for a couple of years we have in the directive this provision that, for example, as you mentioned, for to be able to apply exemption or on intra-community supply of goods, you need to submit the EC sales list, and you need to, let's say, you need to make sure that your acquirer is registered for VAT purposes, for intra-community EU VAT purposes in its member state. And in the preparatory acts and in the reasons, in the grounds for these legislations that we are talking about for this condition, there was this indications that these are substantive requirements, those holding the appropriate document or making sure that your contracting party is registered. So the question is whether these obligations are still procedural or they become substantial just because the legislator says that they are substantial.
That's an excellent point. So it's not only the practitioner in me, but also when I have a look at VAT law, I would say from a systematic perspective that there are the formal obligations in place to prove a certain point, or just to allow to facilitate the application of the law or the collection of the VAT. But in my opinion, there should not be an end in itself. what we also could see in the case law, which I think is also a very sensible approach. When we think about the invoices, where the court said when certain requirements are not there in the invoice, but you have other material that is a proof of a certain fact, then this should not stand in the way. Also thinking about the fact, now leaving, of course, criminal, fraudulent activities aside, which indeed does not concern most of the businesses, luckily, which is sometimes something that I have the feeling that is often forgotten, that we have a very broad majority of diligent businesses that really try their best to fulfill the obligations and usually don't have any bad intention when they get something wrong. And in this sense, they are actually there to collect the VAT on behalf of the tax authorities. They are not intended to bear the burden. So I think it is the court's case law is very sensible in the sense where we have this pragmatic approach. Of course, we couldn't also think about the fact why the court was then so formalistic in luxury trust concerning the requirements for the triangular cases. A fair point that is often made, that as long as there is not case law that is somehow contradicting what I'm just about to say, I would say that you could still have the point made in this context, which also comes out of the decision as such, that the triangular cases, these rules are something of special rules, so they are not mandatory. And if businesses want to make use of what is at least referred to as simplification, I'm not always so sure about the fact whether it's actually simpler to apply these rules concerning all the requirements that are involved. But if they want to make use of it, that they have to fulfill it. I could see a certain case for this, how you could make a distinction there compared to the more general rules. Indeed, I'm very curious what the court will do about this when they now finally have to decide on the case based on the quick fixes and all these amendments that we have seen, where the court will actually follow through with what they have done in other areas, in particular invoicing, what I consider to be a very sensible approach, also considering the fact that, as I mentioned, I would say the vast majority of the businesses, they really do not have the intention just to get it wrong. They are trying their best.
So in other words, even if your contracting party is not registered, but all the proofs indicate that the goods left the country and there was no fraud and so on, you would still allow exemption.
We have case law by the Court of Justice of the European Union also confirming this, particular for a Czech case, if I remember it correctly. Of course, it was before the quick fixes. The big issue is, of course, where the case law is still relevant. I think it is. I could see the point. I would say you can make the case, of course, also saying that this is now explicitly written in the directive, so this should be applied. Perhaps it's just the practitioner and perhaps also the Austrian in me, where we also have a way of dealing with things more pragmatically, that the court will, if the court has to decide upon this matter, and I think they will have to at some point, sooner or later, that they will also keep in mind what is the idea behind the system, and also think about the fact you already punish those that really want to harm the system, and also think about the fact what kind of role the businesses should have.
So you're more leaning towards maybe applying an exemption, but it depends on the details. Okay, thank you very much for this very interesting conversation. It's been already more than an hour, and it was very, very quick. I didn't know when it passed. So it was very, very interesting. By the way, I have to say that taking this opportunity, that actually here's the book. And I will take this opportunity to say about this. This is in Polish. This is formal obligations in tax law. Actually, the great part of it is on the formal obligations and kind of those procedural aspect that we have mentioned, and mainly on VAT, but not only on those ICS exports and some on the difference between what is substantial and what is formal. But from the obligation perspective, so to you and all our listeners, I'm just making a little bit of commercial and advertisement, taking this opportunity. Thank you once more, Stefanie. It was a great pleasure to have you here, and good luck with your further research on the topic.
Thank you very much once again for the invitation, and I hope that I will get hold of this book sooner or later, because I would be very interested in having a look at it.
Sure. I will try to. You learn Czech, so you will have the opportunity to learn some Polish. I will send you a copy. I just need to figure out whether I have any other copies, but I will do my best to send you one. So once more, thank you. Good luck, and all the best to you.
All the best to you too. Thank you. And all the best to our listeners as well. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much. Welcome to the VATvocate podcast, where we explore all things value-added tax to give you the insights you need as a VAT professional.